David Bowman, and I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about the teaching and learning process, and in particular, what is the role of the district level administration and curriculum department in fostering an environment that promotes high student achievement. So we're going to look at the influences on student learning and basically what needs to be in place to ensure that every student is able to perform and has the opportunity to perform at the highest possible level. So my ideas are informed by a lot of years of experience. I've worked at every level just about of the school system, from classroom teacher to district level, state level, administrator, independently as an education consultant and director of federal education programs, evaluator of programs, and so forth. So I have a lot of experiences which are informing and help shaping the ideas that I have formed about the teaching and learning process, and in particular, again, the role of curriculum in this process. When I think about the influences on student learning, those that are within the school system over which we have some control, I think there are 5 major areas. First and foremost is the policy support for learning, but we also have to think about the environment, the instructional approach, the learning resources that are available to teachers and to students, and the assessment system that is in place. So I'm going to look at each one of these individually and share some thoughts about them. When I'm talking about instructional policy, I recognize that there are various levels of policy in place that affect student learning. So certainly we have the state, we have the federal level regulations, of course, but when we're talking specifically about learning, we need to always keep our eyes on the state content standards, which are intended to be the definition of what students know and should be able to do. So they provide the target for what we want students to learn. Years back, when we were redeveloping the state's content standards in language arts, mathematics, and science, the fundamental question that we asked of the participants and that we asked of ourselves is, ultimately, at a particular grade level, at a particular age level, what do students need to know? And what should they be able to do, in particular, in order to prepare them for the next level of learning, the next grade level, leading all the way up to career and college readiness abilities. So that, from an instructional standpoint, frames the top level policy for student learning. But then as we move that to the district level, we have to also, of course, consider the local board of education, the district board of education. What are the priorities there? What is the support at that policy level, which is going to affect what happens at the local level? But then we have the big one, which is the district curriculum, and I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment. From there, we look at what is in place at the school system. What are the school level policies, rules, and expectations that affect learning, and ultimately, what actually happens between teachers and students? The classroom level, what is the instruction that's taking place to support the school programs in alignment with the district curriculum under the realm of the Board of Education's district level policy, and finally the state level content standards. So in regard to district curriculum, when I think about curriculum, I'm really looking at a documented system that contains various key elements. First, of course, is the what. What do we want students to learn? But to support that, we're also looking at the pathway, the scope and the sequence, right? Of what do we teach, when do we teach it, what skills and concepts precede or follow other skills and concepts. Basically, how do we move students forward in order to attain the state content standards, the achievements defined by the state content standards. Then, also within the curriculum, as I've developed curriculum or assisted other teams of folks develop curricula for their districts, what are the resources that are necessary? In order to follow this scope and sequence, what tools are needed at the classroom level? And finally, what assessments are in place? What are those long-term assessments like the annual state assessments? What are those short cycle assessments that are in place? But perhaps most importantly and most immediately, what are those ongoing assessments that'll tell us whether or not students are mastering the skills and concepts that we're trying to teach them, and that will inform our instructional decisions for, the next day, for example. All right, so there's a whole series of policies then that are going to ultimately influence what happens in the teaching and learning process. And right in the middle of that is that district curriculum. And I see the district curriculum as being the bridge between the more conceptual state and district policy and the more practical implementation of the school programming and the classroom instruction. So it becomes a very key piece that really provides that transition from the more theoretical to the more practical. What does it look like in practice, basically? And that's what the district curriculum helps to define. So the next major influence is the instructional environment. Now, sometimes when we think about the environment, we think about, the lights are on and the water works and the building's warm enough, those kinds of things. But I believe we need to look quite a bit beyond just those, beyond that definition of environment. So obviously, the facilities, right? But also, what are the artifacts? When we walk into a school building, or when I walk into a school environment, I look around and I can ask myself, based on my impression, is this a place that supports and promotes student learning? What do I see on the walls? What do I see in the classrooms that says this is a learning environment? Because when we have people that walk into a school building, when we have kids that walk into the door, we want them to recognize that this is a place that values learning and that supports learning and encourages and rewards learning. So do I see that, right? What are the artifacts within the facilities, the physical environment that says this is a place of learning? Now, there's another kind of environment which I call the administrative environment. It's basically the processes within the schools. How do things run? How do things operate? And how do people interact within the schools? A very simple example is this. Do we have kids getting pulled out of classrooms in order to go sign paperwork at the counseling office? What does that teach the kids? The needs of the counseling office are more important than your learning needs. Or do we have an environment that says from this point to this point, we are not going to interrupt students. We're going to hold that time sacred to demonstrate how important it is to us that students are able to learn. Because if we can demonstrate that it's valuable to us as the administrators and the leaders and so forth, we then communicate the message to the students that learning is important. So there's that environment. But there's also the social emotional environment. How do people feel when they're in school? How do kids feel? One of the things that we know from brain research is that emotions are basically physiological responses to internal and external inputs. Translated to more practical terms, what it means is that when students feel capable of accomplishing challenges, then they're very likely able to accomplish challenges. If they feel threatened in an environment, frankly, the wrong parts of the brain are going to be engaged that will then prohibit learning. So if we're not addressing students' social and emotional needs and creating an environment in which they feel socially and emotionally safe, then they're not going to be able to learn, right? That has to be in place, because otherwise the brain is not going to be able to respond to learning opportunities in a meaningful way. So we have to look at that very carefully. So for the environment, from the leadership perspective, if we're looking at fostering an environment for learning, we really need to look at all three of these areas: physical, administrative, and emotional environment for students. Now, take that down from the school or the district level down to the classroom level. What happens in the classroom? We think about interactions between teachers and students. we think about interactions with one another, we think about the types of instructional activities that students are engaged in, and we ask ourselves, are we meeting the needs for all three forms of environment? And I'm going to throw in one last one also, a little freebie here, which is the community environment. So the first three are things that over which we have a great deal of control within the school system. We have an indirect level of influence over the community environment, and yet this has a very profound effect on students' learning. What is the ethos of the community? What is the support and the perspective of the community towards the learning environment? And I think if we're wise, we're going to make sure that we have a very strong two-way interaction with community stakeholders, predominantly with parents, right? We have to make sure that we are informing them of what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it's important, but at the same time, we also need to make sure that we are engaging their ideas and their resources and their interests and using that within our school setting. Because if there's a great disconnect between what we want to do in a school setting and what's being supported in the community, frankly, the community is probably going to win. So we have to make sure we have that collaborative relationship with our community stakeholders. All right, that's environment. Now, let's take a moment and move to the instructional approach, which is what happens between a teacher and a student. What is the actual learning process taking place? And I think there are four different ways that I can categorize or break apart the instructional approach. A growth model, the relevancy of the instruction, the cooperative nature of the learning activities, and the informed decision making. And we'll take a moment and just look at each one of these. So I'm a big believer in the growth model. Whether we're talking about improving teacher efficacy, or we're talking about improving somebody's professional performance, or we're talking about student learning, we have to recognize that nobody's perfect, frankly. That's kind of the bottom line, right? Nobody's perfect, but if we have a clear set of targets, a clear set of expectations that we're aiming for, then we can institute a growth model that moves people from point A to that, wherever they start, where they are right now, to that target. So the first part of that process is to make sure that we have clear and measurable targets. Now, within the learning environment, in many ways, that comes to us from our content standards as translated into action in the district curriculum. So that has to be clear. We have to know what we're aiming for. We have to know it. We have to make sure that the teachers know what we're shooting for. And we have to make sure that the students also understand what are those academic expectations, those learning expectations for them. So how do we get from one to the other? And I think this is where the concept of the zonal proximal development becomes so powerful. Basically what it says is that people learn based on what they already know. And the zonal proximal development is that point at which they take all the stuff they already know and then what they are able to learn with appropriate support following that. Okay, what does this mean? What this means is that if students do not have the necessary background to attain the target performance level, then no matter how hard we teach them, and no matter how hard students try to learn, they cannot get there if it is past their zonal proximal development. And what this means is that what we're really looking for is next steps learning, right? We're here, we know these things, we're going to provide some supports which will allow you to learn this. And then the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing, and eventually we hit the desired outcomes, all right? So how do we do this? Well, certainly we have to look at our assessment data. We have to have a good system in place for understanding what it is that kids actually are able to do. And we have to have something that helps to inform instructors and informs teachers on what those next steps might be. So I'm a big fan of rubrics, which basically say, here's the target and here are the developmental stages. Now, think about an individual student or a group of students. What have you seen them doing? What skills and behaviors have they been able to demonstrate? All right. And then what is the next developmental step towards the desired targets or even beyond them? And rubrics are very good for this. So one of the things that I had developed some years back is a series of rubrics around reading instruction and mathematics instruction. So we look at the various components in those two broad areas, you know, mathematics, statistics, and geometry, and geometric shapes, and numeracy, and so forth, and reading, you know, phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, and all those different things. All right, so what is our target for that grade level, and what are the developmental stages towards that target? Because then what teachers can do is they can look at those rubrics and they can say, the kid's not on target yet. Where do I see them on this continuum? All right. If I can identify that they're at a particular place in the continuum, then what's the next step that follows that? Because if we try to skip the developmental stages, then we set the kids up for failure and the teachers up for failure, and we set ourselves up for failure because the students simply do not have the ability to learn the targeted behaviors and skills and concepts. So those rubrics become very powerful. And you know, we can use them not only for an instructional standpoint on, you know, for a lesson planning and instructional design and so forth, but we can also use them for professional growth as well. What are those skills and behaviors that we want teachers and colleagues and ourselves to possess, and what do we do to get there, and what is the process? Now, the second piece that's listed there is articulation. So generally when we talk about articulation, we're talking about what happens from one grade level to the next grade level. When I was the state's director for advanced placement, this was a huge concept. You know, vertical articulation starting in pre-K, kindergarten, leading all the way up to readiness to take the advanced placement exam. You know, vertical articulation. And the concept makes an awful lot of sense. It's just slightly bigger, a bigger version of rubric-based learning, but both of these fall under the same concept of the zone of proximal development, where we take what we already know, we have a clear target for where we're trying to get, and then there are a series of developmental stages that'll help us move towards it. All of this works if, and only if, we have a good system for ongoing assessments, because ultimately we have to know where our kids in this continuum, right? What can they do? What do they know? And once we have that information, then we can make decisions about where do we go from here. So there has to be some ongoing assessments, and certainly more immediate than, say, the annual state test, or maybe there's a short cycle assessment, you know, fall, winter, spring. But on a daily basis, do teachers know what kids know and what kids can do? And in great part, the guidance on that ongoing assessment is going to come out of the district curriculum. All right, so that's growth. Now, when I talk about the relevancy of the instruction, I'm talking about a few different things. First, the first thing is it purposeful? Why are we doing this? You know, when I was a teacher, one of the questions that I always dreaded, but at the same time really appreciated, is when a student would say, Mr. Bowman, why are we doing this, right? What's the purpose of this? And if I didn't have a good answer, then we're going to do something else until I either figure it out, right, or find a better way. There has to be a purpose for what we do. We have kids for this amount of time during the day and this amount of time in their lives, and yet we are asked to accomplish miracles in their learning. So we have to make sure that what we are doing in that time has a purpose, that we can recognize I'm doing these activities and teaching this content so that students will learn these skills and concepts over here. Along with that, and very much related to that, is the issue of goal-based learning. Much of the definition of purposeful comes from we are making progress towards clearly defined goals. The purpose of this is to get us there. But it also has to be need-based. We talk a lot about differentiation in schools, and that appears to be different things in many different places. Differentiated learning. But there's some practical reasons for that. We talk about multiple intelligence. Great. We talk about students being at different places on the curriculum. Great. But one of the things that we're really trying to answer is, what is the need that students have for our instruction? Or what is the manner in which they're best able to acquire and demonstrate their learning? So if we can tailor our instruction to the learning needs of the child, then we have a much better chance of helping students actually learn. So need-based. But interest-based is also very important. One of the fundamental questions I think that we need to keep in the forefront of our minds in education is, does the student recognize the value? Does the student perceive the value of what we are doing at the classroom level? Maybe not so much for younger students, hey kids, we're going to do these fun things. That's great, right? Lots of fun, very exciting. And students will get a lot of excitement out of it. Hey, I did this neat thing, and they're very proud of themselves, and that's really wonderful to see. But certainly as students get older, they're beginning to ask the question themselves, what's in it for me? What's the value of this for me? And I think we have the responsibility in the education system to make sure that students can answer that. So in many ways, this is sort of the other side of the coin for purposeful learning. We have a purpose for this instruction over here. And on the other side of the coin, the students recognize that it has value to them. The last piece under relevancy is, how is the content relevant to other content? So when we were designing those state content standards, I spent a lot of time going around working with school groups and teachers and different districts about what's in those standards and what the intention is and what's the thinking behind their design. And I always got the exact same question. Somebody would always ask the question, excuse me, but how in the world are we ever going to be able to teach all this stuff? And the answer was always the same. You don't have time to teach all this stuff. There's no way you could do it, right? If you're trying to teach everything as a discrete element. If you're trying to teach one thing at a time, not only do you not have enough time to do it, but you are shortchanging the learning process, because the fact of the matter is, content interacts. What we learn here contributes to learning here. What we learn in chemistry contributes to what we learn in biology. What we learn in English language arts contributes to what we learn with geometry. Okay? There are interactions among the content areas. What we learn in phonics relates to what we learn in phonemic awareness, so we teach them together. We integrate multiple content in multiple content areas into well-designed instructional lessons. So not only do we learn specific content, but we also learn how the content applies and how the content is valuable. It gives us a purpose, which is ultimately going to get us to the target outcomes. So we integrate content, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you think about what we do on a daily basis ourselves, we don't say, okay, now I'm going to practice my Excel skills. Great. No, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be learning some new Excel skills so that I can improve my analysis of student achievement data in order to make some decisions about program design. Multiple things happen at the same time, and multiple skill sets occur at the same time in order to get us to a particular outcome. The same thing happens with instructional content. All right, so thinking about instructional activities themselves, I'm a strong proponent of cooperative learning. Is there a time for individual learning? Yes, absolutely. Is there a time for cooperative peer learning? Yes, absolutely. Okay. One of the things we have to decide from an educational standpoint is what's going to work best in which situation for our outcomes. But the fact, I think, is absolutely true that when students are working cooperatively, they can draw from not only their knowledge and their perspectives and their background and their abilities, but they can also draw from the same things from their peers. resulting in a much deeper and stronger understanding of the content. Now, when I'm talking about cooperative learning, I'm not talking about kids sitting around and one kid is doing most of the work. I'm not talking about cases where, you know, everybody has a little job, but frankly, that person's job over there is just a space filler because it's not really all that important. But we just created that job so that he'll have something to do and feel important. Kids see through this, and they absolutely do. Teachers see through it. In professional development, kids see through it too. So when we're talking about cooperative learning, we're really talking about an instructional design in which students have meaningful roles towards some kind of a group product. They are each contributing meaningfully to the other students' learning. But importantly, and I think this is the piece that often gets missed, they are also responsible for demonstrating their own learning. So they're contributing to the learning of one another, but they are also accountable for their own learning. So we see both sides of it there. In many times, learning is stronger when we learn together, but ultimately we have to be able to perform alone. So a couple of other things that I think fall under cooperative learning here is the issue of active learning. I'm also a fan of active learning. Let's use student movement in order to teach content. It's one of the professional development series that I give is around active learning, which is to say, you know, how do we teach language arts, math, science, and social studies? Through activity, through movement with students. Do we do it all the time? No. Do we do it some of the time? Absolutely, because this is going to work best for a lot of kids. And the nice thing about the sort of active learning process is not only is it cooperative in nature, but the learning becomes unavoidable. If the student is engaged in the activity, inherently the student is involved in learning the content because those two, the activity is being used to teach the content. But there's a last piece that I think is critically important, and that is the issue of social emotional academic learning, or SEAL, social emotional learning. Students, so in 28 years, here's something that I've seen. I think students, fewer and fewer students are able to interact meaningfully with their peers. Fewer students are able to negotiate with their peers. You know, people have different ideas. They have different interests. How do they work together? How do they get along in order to do something which is meaningful for both of them, right? And I think a lot of the struggles that we see, and I think a lot of the, well, frankly, a lot of the violence that we're seeing in schools and a lot of the difficulties and the bullying and all of these things are occurring because students have not developed their social emotional skills. The cooperative learning environment is a prime place for that to occur. So not only learning content, we're also learning how to get along with one another. So the last piece is informed. I think whatever we do in the classroom has to be informed in some way. You know, we talk about purposeful learning and, you know, having certain specific targets that we're trying to aim for and certain approaches that we espouse. That's because we're making informed decisions. So where does that information come from? Well, it certainly comes from the education research. When we designed the whole literacy project, you know, 79,000 kids originally in 84 school districts, we created the design by looking at the research. So the research says these things work, these things are necessary. We said, okay, that's what we'll do then. Turns out to be true, right? So we're always looking at the research. Well, what percentage of teachers are spending time daily, weekly, or even monthly reading education research? I'm going to guess that it's a pretty small percentage. So who's going to do it? That's the role of the leadership. Because ultimately what we're asking teachers to do is implement the curriculum, right? We're going to hold them accountable for implementing the curriculum, which means that the folks that are designing the curriculum need to be well versed in the education research. The education and instructional decisions also need to come from the assessment data. We've talked about that a bit when we talked about the growth model. We have to have clear data relative to our expected outcomes in order to make decisions about what are we going to do on a day-by-day basis. So, and then I talked about curriculum also already there, skipped ahead. So, what is a good instructional environment? What is a good instructional approach? It's one that is going to follow a growth model, is going to be relevant to the needs of the students, is going to foster a cooperative engagement in the learning, and is going to be informed by the research and by assessments. So that's what I'm looking for. When I do teacher evaluations, in the past, or observations, when I've provided professional development, when I've worked different levels, and we talk about how do you make a good classroom environment. These are the 4 things that we're talking about. All right, not so much to say about instructional resources. It's interesting, when I was the state's director of the Instructional Materials Bureau, I seem to always be butting heads with the publishers. They would come and say, oh, let us take you out to lunch at this wonderful place. And I would say, no, you can take my staff. Let them go instead. And they kind of didn't like it. But, all right, my point wasn't to make them happy. My point was to make sure that schools and districts had the resources that they needed and that would be useful to them. And how would we determine that? Well, the first thing that I would look at, and the first thing that I encourage others to look at, is, are the instructional resources appropriate for the learning process and the needs of the kids? Are they insufficient quantity? And frankly, are they necessary, right? When we do federal proposals, we're often asked the same question about our budget. Is it sufficient and is it necessary? Are you asking for enough and are you asking for money for the right things? But they often forget the word appropriate. Is it a necessary activity? Yes. And how do you even determine the necessity of the resources? Because it is appropriate to the learning needs of the students, because it's going to help them reach that zone of proximal development. It's going to align with their interests, and it's going to align with their particular learning needs. Part of that is the issue of substance and glitter. I've seen a lot of very pretty stuff over the years. We've got a warehouse out there right now with probably 30,000 books and materials and resources in it at this time. And I'll tell you, some of it's really slick and some of it's really cute. Well, that's great. It's a lot of fun. But unless it's substantive, unless it is actually going to help students acquire skills, concepts, and behaviors that we desire, then it really isn't meaningful, right? So we have to always look beyond the appearance of something and ask ourselves the question, is it going to help students learn? And along with that, we want to make sure that the resources are supportive of the learning environment, supportive of the learning decisions, and don't supersede the responsibility of teachers to make instructional decisions. A lot of what we see is basically something that says, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. Follow these steps, kids will learn. And we ask teachers to basically just follow directions. Well, the problem with that is that very few students are perfectly average students, right? So when a publisher would come to me and say, hey, this is a book we'd like to have in New Mexico. We've used it across 35 states. It's wonderful, and all these things are great. Well, that's lovely, and I'm glad they're selling a lot. But the bigger question is it going to support the learning of the teacher, who is the only one, who is the best one to make decisions about individual students? Maybe it'll work for particular kids, maybe it won't, right? So we want to make sure that our resources are going to help the teachers they're going to support the teacher's decision making and help to support the instructional process as designed by the teacher, guided by the district level curriculum. And ultimately cost effective. Here's an expensive version, here's a less expensive version that'll do the exact same thing and have the same benefit. Go with the less expensive version. Simple as that. So 4 just guiding principles. If I'm looking at the selection of instructional resources, these are the 4 things I'm looking at. So for example, right now, I carry a pretty substantial budget for one of the nearby school districts. I oversee the budget around physical education, right? And so each school gets a certain amount of money to support their physical education. And they can propose and say, here's what we want to spend this money on. Well, when I'm looking at the request, this is what I'm looking for right here. Now, on this rather glamorous slide right here, let's take a moment and talk about instructional assessment. I've talked a lot about data so far, and I've talked a lot about assessment so far, but let me take a moment and actually talk about what I see as the assessment process. So the assessment process, number 1 at the top, is going to start out with having clear and valid metrics for success. When we say that we are a success as an organization, when we say teachers have succeeded, when we say students have succeeded, on what basis are we making that determination? What is it that we're actually trying to measure? Second, what is the process for collecting data? And is it a reliable, consistent process? If we don't have a clear and consistent process for collecting data, then we can't really trust any information that we get out of it. So there has to be a consistent process. And also, if we don't have a consistent process for collecting data across teachers and across students, then we run the risk that we end up treating people unfairly. So it has to be consistent. Now, once we've got our data, we've got to be able to get our hands dirty and our feet wet. We have to be able to jump into it. We have to be able to ask important questions, relevant questions, meaningful questions, and extract information out of the data to answer those questions. All right. So, for example, one of the things that we looked at. So I've got probably a little over 18,000 lines of student data. All right. Pre and post test, when they took the test, grade level, teacher qualifications, all sorts of things. That's a line. Then there's 18,000 of them. All right, that's a lot of data, right? So what do I want to know? Well, maybe what I want to know is, are teachers with more than 5 years of teaching experience outperforming teachers with less than 5 years of experience? Okay? Maybe what I want to know is, how does the total amount of instructional time correlate to student outcomes? Maybe what I want to know is, for older students, if we are not looking at phonics, does it have a negative impact on their ability to perform reading comprehension? Okay. So there's a lot of different things that we can ask, and we've got to have some pretty strong skills to do that, you know, whether it's Excel skills or whatever the case may be. But it really comes down in number 3 to being able to ask the right questions, have the right data to answer it, and then be able to turn those data into, number 4, into actionable information. Because ultimately, what's the point of collecting data in the first place if you're not going to do something with it, right? What's the importance of creating the charts and the graphs and all the findings if you're not going to actually do something with those data, with that information? So the last step is be able to translate the data through the analysis process into decision making and actions. So then we take actions, we make decisions, we implement those decisions, we collect more data, we weigh it against our metrics for success, and we just kind of keep going around like that. All right. Sometimes we find that we're not asking for the right things. For example, one of the things that I often mention to our coordinators is, as we're making decisions on a semester by semester basis, who do we want back? Who's a good tutor? Who needs some help? Who do we want to get rid of? So what they will often say to me is, hey, I've got these tutors over at the school over here, and the results have been consistently weak. Can I get rid of them? And I say, well, there's a bigger question than that. The first question we need to ask is, are they actually doing what we've told them to do? We have an instructional approach. Are they implementing the approach? Because if they're doing, as far as we can tell, if they're doing everything that we've asked them to do, then we can't really hold the student results against them, right? On the other hand, if we find that the results are poor and they are not implementing the approach that we espouse, maybe we need some intervention, or we need to engage in a growth process or a learning process with that person. But sometimes, if everything else is failing and they're not doing the approach and they're not, they're basically not getting the results, and there are problems in place, maybe then and only then do we replace them. But it comes down to those metrics for success and how we interpret the data. So there's a lot of things that can happen. So for example, one of the things we wanted to know is, what is the effect on classroom instruction? We have these teachers after school, and they work with us for a certain amount of time in this very small group environment. What effect is it having on them in the classrooms, right? If we're teaching them some things and they're building up their instructional toolbox and their approach to teaching, does it have an effect? Turns out it does. It actually has a very strong effect. So I work with 4 school districts from different places around the state. We take a look at their state assessment scores. We compare tutors and non-tutor scores for their classroom students. Is there a difference, right? Turns out there's a big difference. All right, then what do we do with that information? Well, one of the things we can do with that information is work with school districts to implement a similar program of their own, right? We can only support a certain number of teachers and tutors and students, right? But if we can show that those are better classroom teachers as a result, then we can work with them to implement similar programs at their local levels. So we turn data into actionable information. That's the assessment process and its value. So where is the leadership in all this? What is the role of the curriculum department, the curriculum leadership in all of this? And I think very broadly there are 3 things that fall under leadership responsibilities. The first is, of course, to make sure that any decision making is thoughtful and well informed. But I also throw the word collaborative in there. Now, the leadership makes decisions. That's part of their job. To think, to study, to analyze, to know, to ponder, all of that stuff, but then at the end of the day, make a decision. But one of my core operating principles is that the work that we do together is always going to be better than the work that we do alone. So person A over here is still going to make the decision, but getting to that decision may involve persons B, C, and D as well. And one of the things that the leader does is to make sure that the right people are sitting around the table to engage in that process, to make sure that the decisions that are made, especially if they're going to affect teachers and what they do and kids and what they learn, we have the responsibility to make sure that our decisions are the best decisions that we can possibly make based on the information we have available to us, which means in great part that we are collaborating in that process leading up to leadership's decision. Along with that is, I think leadership has a responsibility to have very strong communication skills and be able to engage in collaborative interactions with colleagues, with those with whom they supervise, and with external stakeholder groups, to make sure that they are engaged in the process, to make sure that ideas are clearly communicated, that expectations are not only clearly communicated, but understood by the recipients and those that will be responsible for implementing them. And then finally, I think the big leadership responsibility is to make sure that there is monitoring. If we say this is what we want to have happen, then we need to make sure that there's a process for monitoring its implementation and for supporting it. So we go back to that growth model and we say, here's what we want people to do. And we're going to monitor them and see if it's actually happening. But we also at the same time have the responsibility for providing the support and the resources and the training and the professional development and the coaching and so forth that'll help people attain those expectations. Because if we think about it this way, the reason why we establish an expectation or the reason why we make a decision is because we want something different to happen than what's currently happening, which means people are doing this, We want to see that. So it's our responsibility in that case to make sure that we are providing the necessary support to get people from A to B. It's the exact same thing that we do with students. They know this, we want them to know that. We have to provide the instruction and the resources and support to get them from A to B. Same thing with colleagues, same thing with the people that we supervise and oversee. Ultimately, there has to be an accountability system. We want people to grow. We want people to perform at a high level, but at the same time, we also have to make sure they understand how they are accountable for their individual results. And in part, this is kind of like what I discussed with cooperative learning. There is cooperation that takes place. There's contributions to one another's learning. There's a process that we go through, but at the end, we hold people accountable for what they have done individually. So that, all of that together, all of those thoughts about instruction, assessment, all those things together, the purpose is this, to get to this result here. From the leadership standpoint, from the district level standpoint, certainly from the curriculum office, what we are trying to do is create those conditions that will promote and enable high student performance. That's why we do what we do. And as you can see, I am rather passionate about all of this. This is really where I have spent my last 25 years or so in trying to make this occur, right? To help schools, teachers, the education system as a whole create those conditions that are going to promote high student performance. I very much look forward to discussing these ideas with you further, and certainly I look forward to working with you to make sure that students have that learning opportunity to achieve their best and attain high performance. Thank you very much.